Dear guests, my name is Ville Sinkkonen. I'm currently leading researcher of the Center on US Politics and Power, or affectionately CUSP, at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event, The Crisis in Global Development, Causes, Consequences, and Ways Forward. Needless to say, today's event could not be more topical. To start with an assertion, a definitive shift in both resources and rhetoric has indeed upended the global development sector in recent years. Obviously, the policy changes are most visible in the United States, where the Trump administration has shuttered USAID and made drastic cuts to foreign aid. In reality, however, we're looking at a much broader phenomenon. Throughout the West, states are stepping back from prior commitments to official development assistance. This panel discussion will draw on an excellent FIA briefing paper recently written by our visiting senior fellow, Professor Sarah Stroup. We at FIA have had the opportunity to benefit from Sarah's expertise since August, and I'm thrilled that all of you will now have that same opportunity. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Jane and Aatos Erkko Foundation for making Sarah's visit to FIA possible. Sarah and our other panelists, all of whom my colleague Katariina Mustasilta will soon introduce, will explore the causes, consequences, and possible responses at this pivotal moment for the development sector. What bears pointing out is that in the United States, the Trump administration's policy justifications actually echo long-standing critiques that have been made from within the development sector itself. Meanwhile, in Europe, concerns over migration and security have already changed aid patterns and challenged the idea of a global consensus on sustainable development goals. A frank assessment of successes and failures is necessary to address domestic political divisions over foreign assistance and identify steps by which to serve the needs of the world's poor. I'm certain that today's panel will provide invaluable insights for the kinds of discussions that urgently need to happen in the coming months and years. And with that, Katariina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ville, and good afternoon, everyone, also on my behalf. Let me start by thanking Ville and Sarah and my colleagues at FIA for putting together this really excellent and topical seminar to discuss a very important topic on global development and the sweeping changes that are taking place in terms of global aid industry and the future of global development efforts. So once again, my name is Katariina Mustasilta. I am a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, working on, broadly speaking, international conflict and crisis responses, more broadly speaking even on peace building and conflict preventive efforts, and therefore this topic as well is very close to my heart and resonates a lot with what I've also been observing and writing about in recent years. And I'm really honored to have the chance to chair this discussion. We have an excellent panel of in-depth expertise and wide-scale experience here with us today. As Ville mentioned, indeed, even though the sort of future of global development efforts and the big sort of question mark on top of it got a lot of attention now in the recent year due to the very drastic changes in the US development policy, particularly the abolishment of the US aid and the drastic aid cuts. The phenomenon indeed is a lot broader and dates back in time, also in Europe. I have myself looked at the EU development funding flows, especially from the perspective of conflict and crisis, and we've already seen for quite many years now a gradual shift in priorities and declining aid flows to overseas and particularly to conflict-affected and fragile countries. And I would actually say more broadly there seems to be this sort of broad loss of confidence in global development and the promise in it that really goes beyond Trump administration. The concept note for our program today talks about a definite shift in both resources and rhetoric in global development. And some would even call the current crisis the end of global aid industry, at least the way we know it. Perhaps, however, the extent to which we are now at the moment of end of something and how things are ending and how they are changing is still to be determined. And I at least would like to emphasize that really the way the global aid industry moves on from this pivotal moment and from a moment of crisis depends on the strategies and agencies and actors that take part proactively in that change. And that's why it's so important that we have discussions like the one that we are having today, because not all hope is lost yet, I would at least argue. And I'm really happy about the starting point for our discussion today. That is also the starting point of Sarah's fantastic briefing paper that Ville already mentioned and that really motivated this event, which is that even though these drastic aid cuts and their sudden implications and interruptions in life-saving aid have very understandably and justifiably received a lot of criticism, there is also aspects, at least in the justifications of these cuts, that reflect some of the broader, long-standing criticisms coming from within the development sector and researchers as well when it comes to the efficiency and impact of global development efforts. And therefore, again, it is up to us to see that right now what is happening is not that this sort of criticism takes us from one really bad situation or towards even more bad situation and kind of throwing off baby with the bathwater situation with some of the very constructive criticism, but that we actually at the best way possible could perhaps seize some opportunity in this moment of crisis to reform the aid industry and to see how to move towards a more balanced and equal relationship at the international level and more impactful aid overall. And this is what we will try to contribute today with the discussion and our fantastic panelists. First of all, we have Professor Patricia Giustino, who is the Director Designate of the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research, UNIVIDER, more commonly known here at Helsinki. Patricia will start as the director officially in May next year and has so far worked as the Deputy Director for quite many years already at the Institute. Patricia has over 2 decades of experience in conducting policy-relevant research on equality, governance, and inclusive development. Your research explores how political violence, institutional change, and social policy affect long-term development outcomes. And Patricia has crucially worked extensively on post-conflict recovery, trust in public institutions, and inclusive economic systems, and therefore on matters that are crucial for achieving sustainable development goals and aid in this respect. Then we have Marikki Karhu, who has worked as the Secretary General of the Finnish Development Policy Committee since 2014 and has extensive experience in both sort of policy and political sphere when it comes to national development policies in Finland, but has also background in research in development from FIA, actually from the same program that I work in at the moment, as well as from the University of Helsinki. Marikki also has chaired the Finnish Society for Development Research. We are very glad to have you here today as well. And last but not least, Sarah Straub, Professor Straub, who is our visiting senior fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and professor of political science at the Middlebury College in the US. Sarah is also the former director of the Katrin Wasserman Davis Conflict Transformation Collaborative. The research of Professor Straub focuses on international non-governmental organizations, in particular humanitarian relief, democracy promotion and human rights. Sarah has followed closely the dismantling of development aid, as one could perhaps name it, in the US, but also more broadly. And again, the very insightful FIA briefing paper that you just published looks into the drivers, implications, and the possible constructive pathways when it comes to this sweeping changes in the development industry and the drastic aid cuts in the US and what they mean going forward. So thank you all once again, and without any further ado, we will start with sort of the drivers of the current crisis and this pivotal moment that we find ourselves in, and then we'll go into a little bit more in depth with the implications, as well as then some of the nuances when it comes to what we should keep and how could we reform constructively global development efforts. And then we will have time for questions and comments at the end of our discussion. I would like to start, Sarah, with you. In your briefing paper, you indeed discussed the drastic moves by the US administration to close down the US aid and in top of that, withdraw from many global development frameworks and multilateral institutions. As well, which I think is very good discussion in itself, you discuss the implications specifically to global democracy support and humanitarian relief, which are the two sort of sectors or questions in which the US has as well the US has had a leading role, and the implications are therefore really quite immediate and devastating. But at the heart of your analysis is really this discussion on some of the profound criticisms regarding or concerns regarding global development efforts that also stem from within the development industry and from research, and have now been used, at least rhetorically, as justifications for the taken measures in the US. And I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on this. So first of all, on the drivers of these radical shifts in the US, and how and to what extent they reflect some of these underlying long-standing criticisms and issues within the development sector. And where does this at the moment leave the US and its role in global development efforts? Such a small question to start with.
Thank you, Katarina. Yes, in 6 minutes, we'll get through all of that. Many thanks to all of you for being here for the conversation. I know that there are many pressing global and domestic problems, and you've taken some time out of your day to talk about global development. I'm also really humbled to be part of such a wonderful panel as a relative newcomer here in Finland. My time here has been supported by FIA, by the ERCO Foundation, and by willing colleagues to have this important conversation. So thank you. I want to start with a bit of a reflection about how we have this conversation. As you've now heard several times, in my paper and today, I will connect critiques of development aid that the Trump administration has made to critiques from inside the development sector. And I want to start by saying that that's not an entirely comfortable position. First of all, in the highly polarized context of the United States, pointing out commonalities between us and them risks being painted as a collaborator or somehow trying to build bridges that are impossible to build. Beyond that label, which I'll just take for whatever it's worth, perhaps more importantly, this issue is a personal one for me, and it may be for some of you. Many of my former students, my friends, and my professional colleagues have had their careers devastated in 2025 by the end of USAID and the effective closure of the U.S. Institute of Peace. So this is not an abstract conversation. However, my role as a researcher, and I would say my responsibility, is to look at the evidence and report out on it. So what does the evidence show about where we are and how we got here? I think the evidence shows a few things. First, the Trump administration's attack on foreign aid is personalized, cruel, and the wrecking ball approach is indiscriminate. This does not look like reform. This looks like getting rid of institutions. And second, I believe that the evidence shows that there is overlap, as uncomfortable as it may be, between decades of critique from inside of the development sector and claims being made by the US administration and its allies. Thus, the place that we're in is actually completely uncertain at this moment, given the government shutdown, but the future of US development aid is still being written, but I think the past year makes quite clear that there appears to be no broad constituency in the United States that will step up and defend development aid when it is under attack. That may, in part, and this is open for discussion, be due to an inability to offer effective answers to these critiques that come from in and out of the sector. Let me take a few minutes to elucidate those critiques. If you've seen the briefing paper, don't worry, this will be a brief recap, and if you have not, more detail in the paper. There are three arguments that have been made both inside of the sector and by Trumpian critics. The first is that the goals of development aid have proliferated. Early in 2025, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the US is walking away from aid projects that are dumb. He said that, and continues to say, that the goal is to focus on aid that makes the United States safer, stronger, and more prosperous. Now, what the content of that aid program is debatable in terms of its desirability, but I will say that this is a call to focus the goals of development assistance. That same argument has been made by development professionals. The former chair of the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, Susanna Moorhead, says that the hardest thing for development professionals to do is to decide what is not on the development agenda, that there has been this expansion of the goals of official development assistance, or ODA. Goal proliferation reflects the fact that many things are interdependent. We know that in the work that we do. And yet, it can be bad for tracking progress, monitoring and evaluation. It can take what is a relatively small pool of funds and spread it pretty thin. And it also makes it difficult to tell a clear public story about why we give aid. The second argument coming from in and out of the development sector is about limited progress on the aid localization agenda. In the United States and in Europe, Leaders are making personal attacks on NGOs in particular. I'm an NGO scholar, saying that NGOs are evil, that aid lines pockets of bureaucrats, that there's waste, fraud, and abuse. I personally believe that this is a misdiagnosis of the cause. This is not about bad actors in the development sector. But I do think that there are some broken incentives. Ultimately, I agree with ethicist Hugo Slim, a humanitarian scholar, who says that the aid localization agenda has been, in his words, a stunning failure. In 2016, the grand humanitarian bargain promised to send 25% of all humanitarian aid through local organizations by 2021. In 2021, it was not 25%, it was 2.9%. Samantha Powers made a commitment to aid localization in the United States and made progress, but still that progress has been incredibly slow, given the rhetoric of the development sector. The third critique in and out of the sector is about kind of losing the base of support or not working to cultivate that base. In the United States, foreign aid is associated more with Democrats than with Republicans. Still, every administration since World War II until the two Trump administrations has supported foreign aid. Reagan led a massive expansion of democracy promotion. The Bush administration created PEPFAR. Why has aid declined? MAGA folks say that technocratic aid elites have their own agendas that they advance rather than working on the national interests, and that they prefer supranational agencies over tending to the primary responsibilities of governments to their own citizens. Meanwhile, on the other side, Democrats say that Republicans have moved away from strong national security commitments to populist isolationism. I think there's truth in both claims. But ultimately, what we've seen this year is that development is not a high salience issue for the American public. And what I find perhaps most troubling is that the right knew that the left would be mad. If you read the Project 2025 planning document, Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts writes that the outrage of left-wing experts cannot be prevented. It must simply be ignored. There is work to do in the development sector. We are talking about institutions that come with strengths and weaknesses. I'll end by saying that there is some chance that these debates over USAID are really not about foreign aid, but rather caught up in other political battles, dealing with polarization, technocracy, and research. I don't know if that's a silver lining or that opens up opportunities, but it does suggest that as a development sector, we need to be very attentive to dynamics outside of the sector as well as inside. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that sobering analysis. And I think what you said at the very beginning about being frank about the fact that what has happened now is not about reform, and it is not driven by motivation to actually reform, even if and when it uses some of these aspects that actually have base in the long-standing criticism. I think that's very important, and obviously what is making the situation even more sort of, one could say, depressive or tragic is that, like you referred, Samantha Power, for instance, did try to move forward with the localization agenda, and now where is that now? And so that's obviously even, one could say, a bit bigger question mark than it was prior. But still, and we will get to this, I like what you said at the end, perhaps there is, you know, perhaps this is actually not in the end about development that much, and could that give some space for those who would have the motivation and agency and perhaps resources as well to then move on with reforms and making a more constructive change. But we will get to that. But Patricia, I would like to turn to you now. You again worked extensively on development economics, particularly again from the perspective of sort of conflict and fragility affected societies, and looked at the sort of very challenging development perspectives, and including then international aid and its role in these contexts. From that perspective and background, I would like you to elaborate a little bit on how you see the drivers of this crisis moment in international development and global development efforts. What has led to this, and particularly how does the situation look like from the perspective of these most vulnerable societies and countries that you worked with?
Thank you very much, Katarina, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to FIA for the invitation, and to you. UNUID and FIA have been collaborating quite substantially over the last few years, so this is great that we can carry on doing so. So my brief today is talk about fragile and conflict-affected countries and the implications of this new aid the landscape where we are in development cooperation for these settings. And this is quite interesting because I feel like I'm back in the late 90s again, where these discussions were happening. And somehow I have a feeling that we haven't learned the lessons yet. And one of the really deep consequences of what we are seeing, and Sarah so brilliantly has put together, is what's going to happen in how let's say for use of better word, how the Western world engages with fragile and conflict-affected countries, but also for poverty alleviation. I mean, probably it may be that no one in this room thinks much about poverty alleviation. I very much doubt, and also at least in my view, this is one of the most fundamental key roles of development aid is poverty alleviation. Well, we are now in a situation where we have all these contradictory arguments flowing about. UNUID and the World Bank are co-producing currently a report looking at fragility and poverty with teams from both sides, and I have Laura Saavedra-Lux here in the room, part of the team as well, so any difficult questions, she's there. And the report is not out yet, but one of the arguments we're going to make is precisely about this question. We know that about a quarter of the world population are live in countries who are classified currently as fragile and conflict affected. But these countries count for about, depending on who you trust, counting these numbers, between 60 and 80% of all world's extreme poor. It's going to be over 80% by 2040, which means poverty and fragility are going to become one and the same thing almost. It's the new nature of the challenge that we have in front of us is in order to, if the role of aid is to alleviate poverty, then by logical thinking, you need to focus on fragile and conflict-affected countries. That's where the extreme poor are. But yet, what we see is a reduction of aid and also an increase in conflict and instability. According to our colleagues in PRIO, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, there are currently 59 active conflicts in the world in 34 countries. This is the highest number since the end of the Cold War. We have never seen these levels of conflict across the world since the end of the Cold War. And we know, go back to my argument, we're back in the late 90s, we do know that fragility is a global challenge. This is not a problem of some countries down in Africa that they need to deal with. This is an issue that affects all of us in terms of terrorism, migration flows, cross-border violence, and the rise of organized crime, which is affecting many countries in Europe. This starts off from the problem of fragility in other parts of the world. And back in the day, it took 9/11 to kind of make us wake us up to this problem, and I certainly hope that we don't have to go down that route in order to understand how problematic is the reduction of aid in these situations, right? So because what happens in fragile countries affects peace, affects security and development. And, Sarah just made this point that was it Secretary Rubio making the point that we will have to, go into the countries that will help us keep us safe, or whatever the argument is, but yet you're not. You actually withdrawing from these places. So why, and now going back to the driver's question, why is this happening? Disillusionment. Some of these programs have definitely not worked that well. The crisis that we're facing in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere, the pandemic, climate change, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which has led to enormous shifts in aid allocations. These are enormous challenges that we face. Therefore, and also donor fatigue, right? Some of these programs are difficult. These are incredibly challenging places. So, and of course, donor fatigue arises, shifting geopolitical priorities, etc. From what I can observe, actually all signs point that fragile and conflict-affected countries actually will need more international support rather than less. I just don't see how we're going to do better. And, working for the UN, I need to bring the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals. Currently, there is no single country classified as fragile country that will achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And according to a recent report by the World Bank, achieving SDG 1, the eradication of poverty, will take on average, at the current rate, we're going about 40 years. In some cases, it will take 100 years to achieve SDG 1 in some of these settings. So this is a bit sobering. Imagine that some countries will take centuries before reaching, say, the benefits that we all get living in a country, say, like Finland. So we're talking about very long time trends. But as we're seeing here in Finland and elsewhere, donor countries also face fiscal and political pressures. And those are difficult. These are very difficult questions. Where are you going to best allocate your very, very scarce resources? But one of the areas that, just to finish, is in the area of prevention. And sadly, what we've seen is resources for peace building and conflict prevention have dropped dramatically, and 2023 was the lowest level of funding for peace building, as you know, for peace building and conflict prevention since 2004. So we actually probably, you mentioned throwing the baby with the bathwater. I think that's what is happening. And we're missing this opportunity of actually investing in what could prevent the next crisis from happening. So at the very least, this short-term thinking that seems to dominate needs to take in consideration that what if conflicts keep increasing and if instability keeps increasing elsewhere, it's going to affect us as well. So I'll stop here and then we'll get back to other points.
Thank you so much for this second, also very sobering, but very critical and important contribution. I think there is a clear link also between your and Sarah's points about sort of, that first line of criticism of whether the development sector has sort of expanded too much on goals. But then if we look at the really sort of the core goal, right, that all of us should agree and on paper agree that it is, at the very basic level about poverty reduction, then we should actually be investing more, not less, in these conflict and fragile settings because of this overlapping and obviously interdependence of extreme poverty and conflict risk. And at the same time, like you so well put, this is the contrary is happening. And I think personally one of the reasons also is that there's increasing emphasis on investments, on this idea of development being something that is mutually beneficial, on bringing in private stakeholders in the development sector. And these are all, I can see, good reasons for this. Why? And then we will now go to the sort of European and also Finnish perspective from, donor side. But when it comes to these conflict and fragile societies and most vulnerable societies, this puts even more burden on them because they don't have ready-made investment opportunities to anyone, and so that really sort of makes the equation even harder at the moment, I think, in this sort of political atmosphere where we find ourselves. And indeed, from that, I would like to turn to Marikki. Again, you have extensive experience and expertise, both from the policy field and sector, and also you know very well, also obviously, the political dynamics nationally, but then also as a researcher when it comes to development policy. And I would like to ask you to discuss a little bit how you see the drivers of the current situation and the shifts in priorities and focus in development in Europe, including in Finland, of course, and where do you see us at the moment?
Well, thank you, Katarina, and to FIA for having me and for organizing this event. There's never enough discussion on global development in the Finnish Parliament. When we focus on crisis, it's truly important to understand the root causes as well as to discuss possible ways forward. And it's so great that we can now benefit from the exchange by FIA and CMI to have Sarah here to provide us with this really timely briefing paper. Here it is. So thank you, Sarah, for your insights in the drastic changes by the Trump administration and how it's both causing and catalyzing the crisis in global development. In this turmoil, it's very difficult to see crisis as an opportunity, as so much planetary and human well-being hinges on global development and on our capacity to govern global challenges. And this is particularly true for the fragile context, as Patricia just explained. So my task here is to discuss possible drivers behind the more gradual, yet notable changes in the EU and in Finland. But before going to that, I would like to clarify my take on the larger question concerning the state of global development and the aid system. So my starting point here is that international aid is an important but not the only part of global development and its financing. It does not exist independently from the other fields of multilateral cooperation, peace and security, migration, climate, just to name few, or financial and trading system. Their failures actually increase the need for aid, most notably humanitarian aid. Aid is also increasingly used to support other policies, like foreign policy and trade. So these fields are interconnected, although international aid has had, and to my mind, should have its own objectives, principles, and practices to be effective. So we could have the best aid system in place, but without this coherence, it would never succeed. Furthermore, aid is very vulnerable to domestic politics and instability, both home and abroad. So this said, perhaps it's useful to take a step back and go to the more positive times and to remind us where we were just 10 years ago in global development. So indeed, back in 2015, a major leap reform in global development was taken with the adoption of the UN Agenda 2030 on sustainable development. And in that context, aid was set out to support sustainable development, especially in the least developed countries and in fragile contexts, taking into account the most marginalized groups and individuals. At the same time, donor countries were meant to take a look in a mirror and align their policies with SDGs and pool financing also beyond aid, especially from the private sector. The start and the first 5 years of Agenda 2030 was promising. So there was progress actually made, for instance, in eradication of poverty, and hunger, access to education, in gender equality, and also in terms of corporate social responsibility. And we could at the same time witness this rising trend of ODA to support these objectives also from the EU. But then hit the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. And in the COVID-19 context, and despite the notable inequality vis-à-vis access to vaccines and protection, the EU adopted this very proactive Team Europe approach. Finland was part of it, and much was actually done to increase flexibility of aid to meet the rising needs that there were. But even though this response was crucial, the trends in SDGs started to decline due to the pandemic. And this decline after a positive start could be perhaps seen as a psychological driver of crisis in the background, especially in the countries that are supporting SDGs and agents working for that. So a little bit this fatigue there as well. Now, and however, the hardest hit also affecting aid and global development came from Russia. In February 2022, the horrific war of aggression in Ukraine changed the whole security landscape in Europe. It catalyzed a chain of events affecting also aid and the global development agenda. And from the EU perspective, or from the perspective of EU aid, most concrete change can be seen in the aid allocations and in the anatomy of aid. So support to Ukraine, which is an eligible country to receive official development aid, became the new priority for most EU donors and first recipient of their own assistance. And due to the increasing number of refugees fleeing to Europe, the EU and many of its member states became, curiously, major recipients of their own aid. This is possible as the OECD Development Assistance Committee rules allow this reporting in-country refugee costs for the first year to be reported as ODA. For instance, in Finland, back in 2022, refugee costs accounted for 25% of reported Finnish aid. So because of the war in Europe, the limited aid resources and political focus started to shift away from these global concerns, from long-term partnerships in the global south, and from multilateral commitments to most immediate security concerns, resulting in turn rapidly rising military spending that has only started. So as said before, domestic politics do matter. So in countries, in EU countries struggling with economic downturn, budget deficit, debt, and in countries with, let's say, more conservative and maybe less globally oriented governments, or both at the same time, the change and decline in development aid has been more evident. In fact, majority of EU countries have reduced their aid. Major cuts in aid have been made in Finland, while the other Nordic countries have been more moderate, still holding on to this 0.7 target, with the exception of Denmark for 1 year when they went below the threshold, but they are back, luckily. But also the biggest countries in terms of economy, Germany and France, have also reduced their aid, which has affected the overall EU contribution. So as a result, the level of ODA, the assistance has started to decline in EU collectively. So in 2024, aid level had gone down by roughly 9% as compared to the previous year. And this kind of declining trend is foreseen to become a trend, affecting now also our support, or the EU support to Ukraine. This year, the US closed down US aid and reduced over 80% of its aid. So why this decline matters? It matters because the US and the EU institutions, together with EU member states, they have been the leading actors in the aid system. The EU has been the largest collective donor of official development aid, while the US has been the largest single donor until now. So taken together, they used to share roughly 70 to 80% of total official aid, including humanitarian assistance in the world. So with the US withdrawal now, there is a major gap affecting the system, but most importantly, affecting people depending on humanitarian aid and benefiting from development assistance. So that's where we are at the moment. Perhaps I stop here and thank you.
Thank you, Marikki, so much for this overview. Also a little bit historically, or not historically, but looking back, which I think is very important because we are, I guess it's also part of sort of the way we are trapped in this real-time news flashes and so many crucial happenings taking place all the time that it's sometimes difficult to even remember the pandemic anymore, it seems and feels. And I think it's very important what you noted that in this sort of atmosphere of fatigue and disillusionment as well with aid and then these drastic changes taking place, we should remember that back in 2015 and the early years afterwards with the SDGs, we were actually going on a positive path. And at least part of it was because of the steps that were proactively taken. So that should be remembered now. Indeed, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater again, going back to this metaphor. So, moving on, with the second round of questions, I would like to prompt all of you to think about the negative consequences, which I believe will be rather easy to pinpoint when it comes to these drastic changes, but perhaps more importantly also the gradual change, the broader trend influencing also Europe when it comes to the decreasing aid budgets and shifting priorities. So what, from your perspective, you see as the sort of key risks and negative implications, but then also to provoke a little bit or to play not the devil's advocate, but try to see outside of the box the situation that we're in. Can you think of anything positive or any, as previously alluded, spaces for some constructive steps and reform and new ways of thinking, given the trends that we are witnessing at the moment? And I would like to start, Marikki, with you, because I heard that you might have a list of consequences already ready.
Thank you, Katarina. Well, as for the negative consequence, I would have 5 points on my list, but I think, well, we have to start there and then move towards more positive thinking. First, on my list, I have the most immediate ones, that are lives lost and increase in human sufferance. If we only think humanitarian needs at the moment that have again reached their peak, so we have over 300 million people depending on humanitarian aid, and according to the UN, only 1/5 of the need can be met. And that's perhaps before all the calculations, what are the implications of the reductions. Then maybe the list, well, it will continue. As a second point, as the negative consequences, of course, inability to meet international commitments and treaties safeguarding the planet, like the climate agreement, biodiversity framework, and other environmental treaties, and the Agenda 2030 as a whole, or our support to humanitarian principles and humanitarian law. I think this erodes multilateralism that still brings together the global north and the global south. It gives space for multipolarism that divides countries into competing groups and highlights national self-interest and power positions. I don't think that's the way we want to go. Third, I think the power of example is a little bit dangerous. So downsizing development can be explained and legitimized by models adopted from fellow peers. So this is the new normal. Everyone in the EU is doing that. This kind of discourse that you keep hearing, because that can also lead to this kind of norm erosion. And for instance, regarding aid, the principles of aid effectiveness, and neglecting international norms and rules if they become acceptable, that leaves the world in a much unstable and fragile place, I think. Fourth, I think also that if there's less attention to aid, that normally goes together with less interest in global development or global commitments in more general terms. I try to think of government that has downsized aid, but at the same time would take all the possible initiatives to enhance development elsewhere and push forward most development-friendly policies in other sectors. I couldn't really think of any. So especially the US case, down with development, but also the EU and the US being the leading trading partners with the developing world. And look at the tariff policy by Donald Trump. It's devastating. And fifth, the loss of work already done by development cooperation. So when the cuts are huge, there's very little room for safeguarding priorities and selection. So also those partnerships and programs that have been successful, they kind of face the same end with those that have been less fruitful, perhaps. And related to that is also the quality of aid, and then of course we can see, that the aid is even more stronger tied to the donor country. So, for instance, the recipient country must use the funds to purchase goods and services from the donor, and this is not the way we want to go. So this was the list of negative consequences. I don't know if you want me to continue on the more positive ones or give the floor to someone else in between, and then I can chip in again.
Perhaps you can mention if you have a couple of most promising.
Okay. Well, first of all, aid dependency is not a good thing. So ideally, there can be also positive consequences. It is true that the donor-recipient relationship is unequal, as the other party has the resources, the other don't. But to put it very, very bluntly, but in reality, of course, this masks away that increasingly projects and programs are joint ventures, so both parties are investing in, and new partners can come along, like the private sector and so forth. And also, of course, aid is used in the areas, oftentimes, and by groups that are not perhaps the preferred choices of those in power, such as democracy support, human rights, rule of law, and so forth. But I think that trade and investment are absolutely needed. They're becoming more important than ever before. I know that I was supposed to talk about the positive consequences, but I think that this really makes us to look at those instruments once again, and maybe to avoid the caveat that we would take it for granted that all trade or investment is development friendly automatically because of the imbalance in economic and trading power. But I think that is something that we have to look at. And then the question of localization. I think the agenda has been right, the implementation has been less successful, but I think there's something that we should revisit, and from there to somehow level the imbalances that there are. But I would say that we have to be quite careful when we're talking about the end of aid or the end of aid system.
Thank you so much. Very, very important points. I think especially that what you said about I think it was the third negative point about sort of this becoming the new norm, and also sort of different donor countries emulating each other, and so the threshold lowers to make these decisions as you see that others are doing them as well. And I think that's a very, very important point. And I agree with the sort of positive points or something that could be reformed, aid dependency, of course, but I also think you make a very important point in raising that not all trade and investment necessarily automatically leads to or supports SDGs, for instance. And I think this is actually sort of a rather strong assumption visible in some of the thinking today, that you know, it's we can still keep the same objectives, but now we are just doing it this way, especially now. And I would like to turn to Patricia. If we look at it again from the conflict affected and fragile states perspectives, what would you kind of see as the, and you already talked about some of these implications, but really sort of maybe concrete losses and risks in the current scenario, and perhaps also just jumping back to what Mariki was saying about the localization. There one perhaps could suggest that now that there is less and less international aid, and some of these contexts really kind of almost receive none of it or are left to their own devices. Could this theoretically sort of strengthen localization and local agency when internationals are not corrupting and intervening in ways that can sometimes be harmful as well? To just think outside of the box. Go ahead.
Possibly, possibly, but the challenges are enormous. Let me come back to localization in a little bit, but let me pick up on what Mariki actually said about what are the alternatives, because it's a question about financing, right? Where the funding is coming from. And let me stick to fragile and conflict-affected countries, because that's my mandate here today, so I won't get too much out of that. But the issue of financing development in these settings is extremely complex, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of these countries have been left out of the discussions altogether. I mean, one of the things that we try to do at UN is bring the voices of some of these countries to the forefront of discussions about IFA reforms, international financial architectural reforms, and so forth. And the answer we get from a lot of stakeholders in these countries is, I'm not going to get involved in these discussions because I'll get into trouble with the IMF and other donors. So no one is raising their voices. Therefore, we have a group of countries that are not part of the debate. So, but then the narrative moves on to issues around, yes, bring the private sector, domestic revenue mobilization. But what are the alternatives? Is this really feasible in countries that are so, where institutions are so fragile and weak? Where are the investment possibilities, like Katarina, you mentioned before? Where are these investment possibilities that don't involve the extractive sector and then, you know, in a lot of these cases, making the problem worse? And also, I do think there's a lot of naivety around the discourse of domestic revenue mobilization, especially in some of these countries, because the reality is the fiscal space is just not there. For a variety of reasons, to do with how big the pie is, the funding is not there. But also, I mean, we have a project, side project at UNUI at the moment that actually the tax burden of some of these populations is very high. It's just they don't pay taxes to the state. They pay taxes elsewhere, but not to the state. And so I think there's lack of understanding about the actual context that we're talking about. And so one of the bigger consequences, or one of the big questions that we're going to have to deal with, is the question, are Western donors going to stay engaged in this context, or going to leave? It's a fair question. I know, you know, I mentioned before, donor tiredness. A lot of these projects have not worked. We have the Afghanistan situation where, you know, the withdrawal of support in the country, we know the story. But actually, bringing some of the positivity back to the localization issue. We have some colleagues at New York University led by Sarah Sami actually making the point that we've been too quick criticizing, first, the role of international aid in fragile countries, and second, the localization agenda and how the narrative has failed. But actually, I think the point they make is the problem is that we haven't given enough time to this. We think that problems are going to solve within, you know, donor cycles of 5-year rounds, 10 years at maximum. We're talking, like the World Bank report reminds us, we're talking about centuries. We're not talking about a few years here and there. Even 20 years in Afghanistan is nothing compared to what we should do. And actually, they find evidence that programs that we implemented in Afghanistan 20, 25 years ago are actually generating positive effects. They're small, they're tentative. But actually, it's not probably the time to actually throw everything back to the baby and the bathwater. So maybe we should be a bit more patient. And we see some of these. I mean, it's difficult to defend, but we see some of these small little tentative steps, also in Somalia and Iraq, where there is a little bit of progress. It's just it takes time. And what we do know is examples where the international community has withdrawn Yemen, Sahel, the situation just got worse. So we do know what happens when the withdrawals happened. That is very, very clear. And the other issue, I have to bring this up, I mean, the other issue, there is a moral argument to be made as well. You mentioned, your first point, Mariki, was the level of deprivation and poverty and despair and the loss of human lives. And it's not going to be, you know, that is going to be particularly acute in fragile and conflict-affected countries. I don't know, we're still talking about climate change or not, but there is also a link to be made. These are also areas that are just not affected by conflict, but also affected by extreme volatility in climate events. So we're talking about some of the most desperate populations in the world. So there is a moral argument to be made in addition to the security argument that I've already made before about, you know, investing in these countries is just good practice. It's just better economics for all of us. So what I would say, what are the positive things? Well, the positive things that maybe we should start asking is not whether we should stay or go, but can we actually stay more engaged, more effectively, but just operating in a different way that takes in consideration the actual realities of these countries, rather than the kind of off-shelf type policies that have dominated the discourse so far. So I'll make some suggestions in the next round.
Thank you so much. Really, again, crucial points about the time perspective as well. I'm just concerned if we have the patience at the moment, sort of, as states and in this international environment with the intensifying geopolitical competition and it taking so much focus to actually have that patience and then to do that nuanced reform perhaps and based on analysis that you suggest, but really, really crucial point. Sarah, anything to add to this note?
On negative and possible positive consequences, I'll try not to repeat, but extend. Maybe 2 additional comments on negative and then possible positive outcomes. I think, if I'm hearing correctly, that we're all in agreement that development work is about promoting the economic and development of welfare of people in poorer countries, and that even if you think that the aid industry is deeply problematic, people are suffering in the short term. One thing that hasn't been mentioned here is the U.S. tax on remittances, a huge source of income for developing countries. The Center for Global Development in the United States estimates that Haiti, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Jordan, all countries with close ties to the United States in trade, remittances, and aid will be the most impacted with just horrible suffering. On the politics of aid, I will say another possible negative at this moment is that good ideas get lost in the churn that Katarina was talking about. For example, there's a new U.S. global health plan that talks about how the U.S. government is going to work with governments directly rather than through implementing partners and make plans to transition to local country ownership. I think there are some meritorious ideas there, right? But I think that a plan to transition to country ownership and to cut out the middleman could suffer in at least 3 different points. The first is that I don't personally have tons of confidence that the Trump administration has the duration of attention span to actually see that plan through. So short attention spans and quick churn mean that a good plan gets lost. Number 2, it could be those that could be allies in that effort of building local capacity resist it because of political polarization. Because it's a Trump administration idea, we won't do it. And the third place that it could get lost is because country partners are learning the lesson that the U.S. government is an unreliable partner in development. And so there's resistance in the field from that potential partner. So there are lots of different places where good ideas could get lost. What are the possible positive consequences? 2 that I thought about that I'll float here. I do think that there is great work happening already to identify the most impactful aid programs focused on poverty eradication, and put the remaining resources into those efforts. In the United States, a bunch of ex-USAID people invested in something called Project Resource Optimization. They took a list of all of the stuff had been cut. They found the things where the evidence was the strongest and the impact was the biggest, and they asked philanthropists for money for that. And those projects are now fully funded for some short term at about $125 million. That is 0.3% of USAID's entire budget. So philanthropy is not going to fill the gap here, but I do think that there's a distilling power of this moment to say, where is our evidence the best? Where is the impact the biggest? Let's make sure that we're putting our money there and focusing on SDG 1 poverty eradication. I am not saying that other social and public good goals aren't important, but if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And so focusing on SDG 1, that long work of 40 to 100 years of working on poverty eradication, that's a big enough job. And so how can we focus our attention on that? So that's one possible positive consequence. The second, as an NGO scholar, this might sound too cute, so I apologize, but can we make NGOs great again? I have colleagues in the US who've written an essay in Foreign Affairs about the end of age of NGOs. Sarah Bush and Jennifer Hatton had an essay this summer. I don't think that they hope that it's the end. I don't either. But I think that there's something wonderful about NGOs that we might reclaim at this moment. The supposed reason to work with NGOs is because their small size and their independence allows them to be agile, responsive, innovative, connected to actual beneficiaries. The reason to work with NGOs is not because they replicate bureaucratic structures at USAID and the UN. So returning to that relative benefit of NGOs, I think, is something that might come out of this moment.
Thank you so much for the really already a concrete almost suggestion of what could come out of this, and I really like that note that you also have in that paper about if everything is a priority, then nothing is priority, and I do think there's some truth to that indeed. But I would like to still have another round of questions before I open for questions from the audience. I'm building on what you, Sarah, said about the making sure that good ideas wouldn't get lost, or the sort of risk that in this moment also good ideas get lost, or as we have said several times, the baby is thrown out with the bath water. So meaning that even though there is now this sort of understandable fatigue in some sense, and we all sort of know that things should also be changed to some extent, and not everything has worked, I feel like there's also consensus around this table that there is a lot that has worked, at least better than what the sort of direction now seems to be, and should be preserved and even perhaps doubled down. So I would like to hear more on this. What do you think from the sort of traditional development cooperation, or not even traditional, but these ideas that have been floating and implemented as well to some extent in the past couple of decades in particular? What is crucial to keep and preserve, and what could also help to shape in a more constructive way the change that is taking place, given that there are declining aid budgets and shrinking resources that we sort of know of? What should be kept, and perhaps then is there something indeed that could be thrown away or let go in these circumstances? Let's start with Patricia.
Okay. What can we keep? Maybe I focus the question actually, what can we do better with what we have? Or what we have done, because like Sarah mentioned, I mean, there are hundreds of evaluations about what has worked and not worked on a variety of outcomes. these days is what development economics really is about, is evaluation of endless programs. So we know what's out there. I'll make 4 very obvious points that we've probably been going on about it for several decades. I see Olli Romahki here in the room. I think we've discussed this on many occasions. And then 2 sort of reality checkpoints. The first one, despite what we see on the media about some bad apples out there, peacekeeping works. Peace building works. Several colleagues at the University of Oxford and the University of Milan have excellent research showing exactly how well it works in some circumstances. Well, in most circumstances. And that brings to the point I made before about investing in prevention and peace building is quite important. And it should be a priority, not just crisis response. We seem to be constantly on a crisis response mode. Our colleagues at UNDP, for instance, just to quote, they have estimated that for each $1 invested in prevention, the world saves about $16 in crisis costs down the road. So, it's been computed. There's a number attached to this. So maybe we need to rethink some of these issues. I won't repeat again, but I have to say long-term engagement matters. I've said enough in the previous round. But we need to keep saying progress, especially in the countries, in fragile and conflicted countries, but in all other countries, is not a linear progress. And you go back and you go forward and you go back, and sometimes you go back quite a bit in order to go forward a little bit more. And that's just a reality. And it's a generational endeavor. It's not something that is going to be fixed quickly. Then let me repeat again, it's one of the criticisms that comes out over and over. The development community needs to stop working in silos. We need better coordination. And we know that, people's lives are not divided in sectors. Needs are not in health, but not in education, or it's all combined. And so this sectoral approach is not particularly helpful when we're dealing with some of these really complex situations. One of the possible solutions, pool funding, coordinate better. Then your dollar is going to go further if you don't have 3 different donors doing exactly the same program in the same place. We have donor fatigue, but we also have community fatigue. There are certain communities in the world that see more donors and donor interventions than they have people in them. So that problem is there, and we know about it. So maybe then that's a role for, we haven't talked about multilateral organizations yet, and the end of multilateralism has also been hailed in some of these discourses, but maybe that is the role of multilateral organizations a bit. We've talked enough about local actors. I'm not entirely certain. I fully agree with Sarah on making NGOs great again, but growing local NGOs, locally grown NGOs maybe would be the sort of what we may need, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is improve the social contract between citizens and states. So we do need to work with states, but it's not necessarily very easy. So that brings me to the reality checks. Failure is unavoidable if we work in development. I don't quite understand why donors have so much difficulty dealing with this fact. Failure is going to happen, and it may not necessarily be a bad thing, because there are lessons to be learned when things go wrong. And yes, targets may not be met sometimes, but maybe you've met another target elsewhere. And but what we know that really goes wrong is redrawing from situations without proper planning. Then definitely things go wrong. And then I'll leave it with this. This is my last point. Politics is at the center of whatever the solution is going to be. Certainly in terms, fragility is fundamentally a political problem. I'm an economist. And economists, technically, we know how to fix some of these issues quite well at the technical level. I mean, it's not, we've worked for decades on some of these issues. You give me a country that has a poverty problem, well, technically we can fix it in different ways, but it ends up being it's a political problem. And And we need to understand and grapple with these very messy situations. And aid agencies itself may have to accept that there are political risks, and there are, you might have to engage with unsavory agents, let's put it in some ways. It's unavoidable. And these coalitions are will be beyond what we may be willing to accept in some ways, but it is what it is. It is a reality. So if anything is going to be advanced, this is what I call the reality check. We do need to be aware of them. And yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. There is so much there that I would like to continue from, but time is short, so which one would like to go first? Mariki, Sara?
Thank you. So what to keep and what to throw away? Well, I think, in my view, a lot has been done during the past 20 years in terms of improving quality of aid. I mean, we have this aid effectiveness agenda. I don't know how many remembers that, but it's there. It's still very valid. So the principles: ownership, there you get the localization, local NGOs, if you like, alignment, better coordination, harmonization, managing for results, and mutual accountability. I mean, that is a lot. This together with risk awareness, understanding the local context, human rights-based approach, results-based framework, multi-stakeholder partnership with civil society and private sector with joint goals. I think this could be the core to keep. I hope that the EU and its member states will stick to that. But what to throw away? I think this also has to do with the reality check that you mentioned. Well, there are so many unrealistic expectations towards aid, so aid can never succeed. So aid is an instrument. When it's used well, it's oftentimes very useful to reduce human sufferings and improve quality of life, and also produce social and economic well-being. So it's there, but it's not enough. And then I think that we have the Agenda 2030 still there. If we can, in a way, create the momentum in 5 years' time to maybe to have 2.0 version of that, and political will to back its implementation. I think that's a good way forward, and I hope that will materialize. I mean, no silver bullet, but don't throw away the good work done.
Thank you, and Sara?
Briefly here at the end, I do think that the question is a great one. And there are going to be a lot of things that are beyond the control of development professionals that will shape the future of development, like how much China embraces multilateralism will have a huge impact on what happens at the UN and in development work. But within those things that development professionals and their allies can control, I think there's one thing that I would ask that we throw away. And I'm taking inspiration here from a former Oxfamer who is at Boston University, who's talking about public communication around development. And his line, if you don't know what a log frame is, it's an assessment mechanism for development projects. His line is, don't bring a log frame to a meme fight. Development professionals are bringing technical language based on their expertise, and they're losing the public communication battle. It should be a simple story about why we help people who have fewer resources than we do, because it's good for us and it's good for them. And we have lost that simple story, and because of that, we're losing the political battle. Thank you.
I love that. Yeah, I was just thinking about my final points, and that really sums it up, that we have quite a lot of research and analysis and technical expertise as well that actually gives us all these things what to keep. But in the current political environment, both in a lot of places domestically and nationally, but internationally as well, does it really matter, and how to make that matter if you try to bring log frames into a battle of memes? I think that's a really, really crucial point, and goes back to also these reality check points made. Okay, at this point we still have some time left, so now I would like to invite you to ask questions, And before you do so, please introduce yourself briefly, and then if you have a question to one of our speakers, please point that out. And let's try to keep them relatively succinct. Let's start with the ambassador over there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And to be brief, I wrote it down. Thank you for the panel. And Katarina, your work in 2024, I think, was very insightful and on point. And now it's proven to be, very timely. Thanks to the panelists. I just want to ask Dr. Stroop. It is clear that not all NGOs have borne fruit, and that possibly criticism of them and cuts are influenced by that. Dr. Stroop, as an NGO scholar, would a solution to improve the work of NGOs be establishing a specific limited time frame for their existence, after which they should be closed and cease to exist? This was the case of two successful NGOs founded by former President Mary Robinson, one being Realizing Rights, that closed in 2010, delivering impactful results with specific programs. This encouraged the teams to commit to specific attainable goals, like those mentioned in your very good papers, such as reducing harms by developed states in areas like finances and trade. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's collect a couple of questions. There was two over there and one over there in the back, and one over there. Okay, and then we will get back to our speakers. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Gunvor Kronman, and my role in this would probably be that I'm global chair for a global NGO called Plan International since many years. Also used to be the chair of the Development Policy Committee many years ago. One comment, quick comment and one question. The comment is that after the first shock, because I cooperate a lot with the other global NGOs, after the first shock of what happened when 30% of the funding basically overnight disappeared from the sector, I think there is a lot of reform work starting in the sector. A lot of these points that were raised here are actually being addressed by the sector itself in terms of refocusing the agenda, sharing of resources. The sector will be smaller, but I want to believe that it also will come stronger out of this. But my question is around, because we've been talking a little bit here both about development but also humanitarian aid, whether you see difference in how these will go forward, and maybe a special comment around the privatization of humanitarian aid that we see happening. Maybe the most flagrant example, the Global Humanitarian Foundation in Gaza, but we see this also happening elsewhere. What will the consequences of this be, and how can we uphold the humanitarian basic principles in the future, which are probably beneficial for all humanity? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there was one behind as well over there.
No, yeah. Yes, my name is Daniela Garcia, and I work with a network of think tanks from the Global South. I actually have two questions. The first one is more probably for Patricia. I was thinking a lot in this particular context of uncertainty while the system is undergoing this sort of restructuring, and there's the time to, it will take some time to develop a new paradigm. What would you say could be short or medium-term priorities to concentrate on for institutions that are still operating in these fragile and conflict-affected countries, or maybe for emerging local actors that are trying to cover the gap? What could be in the short or medium-term priorities or actions? And then the second one is for Sara. I think you already mentioned a bit about it in the last statement about public communication, but thinking about the element of patience and that progress takes time, and this idea of long-term engagement makes me think a lot about public perception, and the idea of foreign aid is not often seen as something that benefits us all. It's often seen more as a zero-sum game, or as someone is taking something from us. So what would you say could be strategies in the public perception area that could maybe shift that idea, if we're talking about, like, if we don't want to insist on the mutual benefit as an investment? So if it's not zero-sum and mutual benefit, what could be perhaps another avenue to portray development action as something that does benefits us all, but not in this investment-based way? Thank you.
Thank you. And then 2 questions over here in the back first. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the insightful discussion. My name is Mari Pasulaik. I'm from the Finland. I work there in the international program focusing on environment, peace, and conflict and their interlinkages. The UN Environment Programme has estimated that up to 40% of interstate conflicts between 1950 and 2010 were linked to natural resources. Against this backdrop, I would like to ask, how do you see the role of biodiversity loss and climate change in this current crisis of global fragility, and especially in relation to fragile and conflict-affected states? And conversely, could environmental and natural resources issues also serve as potential entry points for stability and cooperation? And if they were more systematically integrated in the development and peace-building policies? And this is at least to Patricia, but I'm happy to hear responses from you others as well if it feels relevant to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then over there.
Yes, hello, I'm Suvi Virkkunen representing the Finnish Red Cross. Thank you so much for really, really insightful discussions. I have 2 comments and a question, if that's all right. On localization, very important how many times it came up from the humanitarian sector. It has been, since the Grand Bargain, the humanitarian actors, especially the Red Cross, have really been trying to push for a shift in the system so that it would be led by local actors. But I want to highlight that it is not only about humanitarian assistance, right? We are talking about locally led adaptation and how many challenges in getting funding to local actors in climate-related, in development, state building in conflict and fragile state situations and so forth. It is at the heart of development cooperation, that it's the local actors who build the capacity and can lead their way. So just to comment on that. My second comment has to do with poverty reduction, and I guess the focus on poverty reduction is really at the heart of what the humanitarian assistance is. It's to keep life-saving and protection activities for the most vulnerable people. But again, that it needs to be understood in a broader sense as well. So how is poverty eradicated? It is with health, it's with education, it's with stability and so forth. So we are very much forward-looking in this crisis to refocusing, making sure that it is at the most vulnerable situations for the most vulnerable people. But you shouldn't simplify it to something that is only life-saving and somehow expect the rest of the development to happen on its own. And there comes my question to I think it was Mariki who said that ODA is somehow responding to failure of other policies, whether it's climate or diplomacy and so forth. So what ways forward do you see on that? Thank you.
Thank you so much for excellent questions that really touch upon a wide range of topics that we've discussed, but also bring in some new thematics like environment and climate that we haven't talked about that much, as also Patricia, you pointed out. So now I would like to give all of you a chance to reply. You can respond to all of them or some of them, or the ones dedicated at you or addressed at you. These will also be your final remarks at the same time in the event, so choose your words carefully. No, but let's start with Sarah. Go ahead.
Thank you again. We never have enough time for the conversation, so I won't try to cover everything. I'll say maybe 2 things to my point about innovative NGOs. I think the idea of an established time frame for a pilot effort is about being risk acceptant and embracing failure, to Patricia's point. So I think that there's something very focusing about having a time-delimited period to work on a project that might make NGOs risk acceptant and launch some really innovative ideas. NGOs debate amongst themselves, so I won't say that there's a single NGO position here, and much more to say perhaps perhaps on the humanitarian and development comment. But I will say at this moment that one place that people's attention is going is to humanitarian relief, because there seems to be this kind of basic idea that we can alleviate suffering and tend to basic needs and that it's apolitical. And there is large public support for humanitarian relief across many different contexts. My concern, if we're thinking about official aid, is that the amount of aid that is being channeled to humanitarian relief has been growing over time, and many humanitarians refer to that as a humanitarian alibi. That is, powerful states, instead of actually doing things that could truly change the well-being of countries on trade policies, finance, other things, are saying, we're doing something, we're giving humanitarian aid. And so I have some hesitance about saying that the place that we should go at this moment is to focus on basic emergency assistance. Thanks again.
Okay. Okay, let me just then just pick a couple of points, because some of it was mentioned already. Let me pick on the point of whether the environment would be a good entry point. I fully agree. I think we made the point that we're talking about populations that are extremely vulnerable in a lot of the cases that we talk about to climate change events, etc. There are ongoing discussions about bringing peace objectives to climate financing, which I think is a very positive way of start thinking about these things, or thinking about the restructuring the international financial architecture with peace as one of the objectives. At least there is some. I think the UN Security Council brought some of these to the forefront, and I think there is. I think it's a positive. You were asking about positives, Katarina. Maybe that's one way of seeing this. I agree with all everyone said about humanitarian versus development. The lady mentioned that point there. I don't think we can separate, because you can eradicate poverty, but without development interventions, so-called interventions, you will not break poverty traps. You will reduce the number of poor people, or you will alleviate immediate poverty, but you're not going to break the poverty traps. Most populations, we know, will fall back in poverty if you don't have development interventions. And just, if you allow me, just one quick point on public perceptions, which was brought first by Sarah, and then someone asked this question about public perceptions. I think one of the issues why there are these negative public perceptions about development aid out there is a decline in trust between citizens and states in Europe and the US itself. We do not trust our governments to use our money in the best possible way. We've just produced UN-UID and UN-DESA, the World Social Report 2025, and the numbers are very striking. So I suspect there's something in there that actually needs to be addressed. It's about good communication, but also addressing a fundamental decline in trust in donor countries as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just noticed we have maybe 1 minute, not even that. So I'll be very brief. I will touch upon two questions raised here. Since I was mentioning and discussing about trade and investment, and I think that is very much linked to the question of the environment as an entry point. If you look at the government white paper in Finland or in many other EU states, you can see that there is this race to critical minerals, and you know that sector is very vulnerable to both exploitation of labor rights, child labor questions, and so forth. I think that could be something, and of course poverty. I mean, the linkage is there. So, I mean, that could be really also being strong entry point also for better communication to really show these linkages. And this, in a way, links back to Suvi's question about the coherence. So, to get rid of maybe there's too many expectations around aid, but discuss this, how different sectors contribute or don't contribute to development. Then back to poverty focus, I very much welcome that, but in the broader scope, like SDGs, because in order to tackle the root causes, you have to understand why poverty exists, and we have to think about human rights at the same time in order to be effective. So no simple answers, but I think these are a few thoughts that are worth taking forward. Thank you.
Thank you all three. Thank you, Sarah, so much for the paper and for inspiring this event. And it has been such a pleasure and still is to have you as our senior fellow at FIA. And thank you, Patricia and Marikki. This discussion has been fantastic. Luckily, I don't have time to summarize it because it has been vast and rich. But I would like to point out one point that has sort of repeatedly come up, and it's this sort of environment of, yes, fatigue and disillusionment with aid. But I think we should ask what that is based on, both in terms of time perspective, as Patricia pointed out. So are we actually sort of judging the results too early and sort of very impatient? But also in terms of the evidence and analysis on what works and what doesn't. And that actually is there. There is plenty of research and analysis and plenty of good suggestions already on how to do better. But I think one key challenge in the time that we live in is also how to communicate that and how to sort of strategically do that so that it flies in the current political environment, both in our societies and also globally. But I would like to thank you everyone once again for showing up and for really active discussion. Again, you can read Sarah's paper online, and I'm sure we will continue the discussion going forward. But please join me in applauding our fantastic speakers.